I watched my stepmother hold up the envelope I'd just handed my father and give it a little shake, the way you'd shake a birthday card from a child to see if money would fall out. Nothing did. She smiled at the 30 people gathered in my father's living room and said, loudly enough that the conversation near the fireplace stopped entirely, "Another card, Robert. How sweet. Claire always keeps it simple, doesn't she?" The laughter that followed was polite at first, then fuller when my half-sister Laura added from across the room, "She's been saying for 3 years she was going to fly in from Vancouver with something special. Guess this is it." More laughter. My father smiled uncomfortably and set the envelope on the gift table without opening it. He didn't look at me. What none of them knew was that inside that envelope was a single piece of paper. A letter, printed on the letterhead of a private equity firm based in Vancouver. A firm that I had co-founded 6 years ago. A letter confirming that the outstanding debt on my father's construction company, $460,000, secured against this house, had been purchased from the bank and fully forgiven. Effective that morning. I sat down on the couch next to my aunt and accepted a glass of sparkling water and said nothing. My father turned 60 that afternoon in a house that, technically, he no longer owed a cent on. He just didn't know it yet. Neither did my stepmother, who had spent the better part of 3 years making sure I understood my place in this family. I should tell you how this started, because none of what happened that evening will make sense without it. My parents divorced when I was 11. My father kept the construction company his own father had built from nothing in the 80s, a mid-sized operation out of Mississauga that did commercial interiors and some light industrial work. For most of my childhood and into my 20s, it did reasonably well. My father was good with clients and my mother had quietly handled the books before the marriage ended. After she left, he hired people to do what she used to do, and none of them were quite as careful. I moved to Vancouver at 24 to finish a graduate program in computer science. While I was there, I met 2 people who became my business partners, and the 3 of us built something that, 8 years later, we sold to a larger company for more money than I have ever said out loud in front of my family. I reinvested most of it. I live modestly. I drive a used Subaru. I rent a condo in Kitsilano. When I visit Toronto, I stay in a hotel because my father's house has been Diana's domain for 3 years now, and I have never once felt welcome in it. Diana came into my father's life at a moment when the company was already struggling. I knew this because my father still called me every few months, not to ask for help, but to talk. Those calls had a quality to them, a kind of careful cheer that told me he was managing something he didn't want to name. In one of those calls, about 2 years ago, he mentioned almost in passing that the bank had restructured his line of credit. I asked a few quiet questions. Then I made some calls of my own. The debt was real and it was serious. The company had lost 2 major contracts in 18 months. My father had put the house up as additional security. If things continued the way they were going, he would lose both. I did not tell him what I was about to do. I knew he wouldn't accept it if I asked. He was proud in the way that generation of men tends to be proud quietly, stubbornly, to the point of their own damage. So I didn't ask. I contacted the bank through a numbered company, made an offer on the debt, and when it was accepted, I instructed my lawyer to prepare the forgiveness letter and hold it until the right moment. I had been planning to give it to him privately, on his birthday, before the party, just the 2 of us. That was the plan. But Diana had scheduled a hair appointment that morning and asked me to arrive with the other guests, so things don't get complicated, which I understood perfectly well was her way of ensuring I did not have any time. Alone with my father before she'd had a chance to set the tone for the day. So I arrived with the other guests. I put the envelope on the gift table with everything else, and I waited. The party was 40 people in a house that comfortably held 25. Diana had hired a caterer and someone to pour wine, and she moved through the rooms the way people move when they want everyone to notice how well they move through rooms. She wore a dress I recognized as expensive. Laura, her daughter from her first marriage, stayed close to her mother's side and echoed everything Diana said about 2 beats later, the way she always did. Laura was 26 and worked in marketing in Etobicoke. She had never been unkind to me in any direct way. She was just always there, always watching, always making small adjustments to whatever I said to tilt it slightly away from me. I had spent 3 years trying to figure out if she was aware she was doing it. I still wasn't sure. My father seemed happy. That was the thing that made all of it bearable. He genuinely seemed to be having a good time, talking to his old friends, holding court near the kitchen the way he used to when I was small. I spent the first hour and a half circulating, talking to relatives I hadn't seen since the last Christmas I'd managed to attend, answering the usual questions about Vancouver and whether I was seeing anyone, and wasn't it hard being so far from family. It was my aunt, my father's sister, who first said something to me about Diana's comment at the gift table. She leaned close and said, in that careful way she had, she shouldn't have done that, in front of everyone. I told her it was fine. She looked at me the way people look when they know you don't mean it. Around 8 o'clock, Diana called the room to attention. She gave a toast. It was well written, I'll give her that, funny in the right places, warm enough to seem genuine. People applauded. My father looked touched. Then Diana said there was one more thing she wanted to share with the family, since so many people they loved were gathered together. She said that she and my father had been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about the company, specifically. She said that the last few years had been challenging, no secret there, she said, glancing briefly in my direction for reasons I couldn't quite interpret in the moment, but that they had a plan. She and Laura were going to take on more active roles. The company was going to evolve, and as part of that evolution, they had decided it made sense to consolidate the ownership structure. She said this in the particular way that people say things when they mean something more specific, but want the room to hear the polished version first. I understood what she meant. The company had always been structured with the understanding that it would eventually pass to me. Not formally, my father had never changed his will as far as I knew, but it had been assumed, by me and by him, since I was a teenager watching him do estimates at the kitchen table. What Diana was saying, dressed up in the language of evolving and consolidating, was that this assumption was being revised. I looked at my father. He was looking at his glass. My aunt put her hand on my arm. I didn't move. Laura started clapping and a few others joined in, not entirely sure what they were applauding, and Diana smiled and said, "We're so excited about the future." And that was when my father's phone rang. He glanced at it, apologized to the room, and stepped into the hallway. The party resumed. Diana accepted compliments. I refilled my water. My father was in the hallway for 4 minutes. I know because I was watching. When he came back, something in his face had changed. Not dramatically, he was a man who had spent 40 years managing his expression in front of clients, but I had known that face my whole life, and I saw it. He went straight to Diana and spoke quietly in her ear. Her smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded, the way a light fades when the power dims slowly rather than cutting out. She excused herself from the conversation she was in and followed my father back into the hallway. Laura noticed and followed them. I stayed on the couch. 3 minutes later, Diana came back into the living room. The smile was entirely gone now. She found me with her eyes across the room and crossed to where I was sitting with the directness of someone who has decided to skip several steps. She sat down across from me and said, very quietly, "Did you know about this?" I asked what she meant. She said the bank had called. There had apparently been a change in the status of the company's debt. Some kind of administrative issue, she said, though the word she was searching for was clearly not administrative. She said the bank was saying the debt had been transferred to a private entity months ago, and that they didn't seem to have a clear record of who that entity was. I said I was sorry to hear they were having trouble with their records. Her eyes narrowed. "Claire." I looked at her. I didn't say anything. "If you know something about this," she said, "now would be the time." My father appeared behind her. He looked at me the same way he'd looked at his glass during Diana's toast. Not ashamed, exactly. Something more complicated than ashamed. He sat down in the armchair across from us, and the three of us formed this small triangle while 40 people moved around us talking about things that had nothing to do with any of this. I said, "Dad, did you open my card?" He looked at the gift table. The envelope was still there, untouched, exactly where he'd left it after Diana made her joke. He got up and got it. He came back and sat down and opened it. He read the letter. He read it again. The color left his face in a way that looked like relief and terror arriving simultaneously. Diana said, "What is it?" "Robert, what does it say?" He handed it to her without speaking. I watched her read it. I watched her read it a second time. I watched the moment she reached the name of the firm and stopped. She looked up at me. "This is yours." I told her it was. "You bought the debt." I told her I had, about 8 months ago, and that as of that morning, it had been forgiven in full. The house was clear. The company's obligations to any lender were gone. The silence between the three of us was so complete that I became aware of how loud the party was around us. Someone was laughing at something near the front door. The person pouring wine was asking a woman in a green sweater whether she preferred red or white. Diana set the letter down on the cushion beside her. She looked at my father. He was still looking at the paper. Then she looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked like she didn't know what to say. It was my father who spoke first, he said, very quietly. Why didn't you tell me? I said because he wouldn't have let me. He didn't argue with that. I said I had been watching the financials for almost 2 years. I said I knew what the bank restructuring meant, and I knew what came next if nothing changed. I said I wasn't going to let him lose the company his father built, or the house he'd lived in for 22 years, because of 2 bad contracts and a credit line that got away from him. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Diana. She said, "You could have said something. To us. To me." She said it carefully, like she was trying to find solid ground. I said I didn't think that would have gone well, and I said it without any particular weight behind it, just as a fact. Laura had appeared at the edge of our group at some point without my noticing. She was standing behind her mother's chair with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She looked young, suddenly. She said, "So when you came here today, you already knew all of this?" I said yes. She said, "And when my mom made that comment about the card," I said yes. She sat down slowly on the ottoman to my left. None of us said anything for a moment. My father cleared his throat. He said, "The plan Diana mentioned, about the ownership," I said I had heard. He said, "That was something we had discussed. There were some conversations. I want you to know it wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't think you wanted it. You've built your own thing out there." I didn't think. I told him he didn't have to explain. I told him I wasn't there to argue about the company or about ownership or about any of that. He asked what I was there for then. Not unkindly. Genuinely. I thought about it for a moment. I said I was there because it was his birthday. Because he was 60 years old and his company was his father's company, and I had the ability to make sure he didn't lose it, so I had. I said the letter was a gift, not a negotiation. There were no conditions on it. The debt was gone, and what he did with the company after today was entirely his own decision. Diana said, "That's very generous." The word generous sounded like it cost her something to say. I said I hoped she had enjoyed her toast. There was a silence. Then something crossed her face that I had not expected. It wasn't embarrassment exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than embarrassment. It was the particular expression of someone who has said a cruel thing in a moment when they thought it was safe to be cruel, and who is now reckoning with the distance between who they thought they were and what that moment revealed about them. She said quietly, "I shouldn't have said what I said. About the card. That was unkind." I looked at her. I told her I appreciated that. She nodded once. She didn't look at my father. We sat there for another minute, the 4 of us, while the party went on around us. Then my father stood up and said he needed some air, and I stood up and followed him through the kitchen and out the back door onto the deck he'd built himself the summer I was 13. It was cold the way October in Ontario is cold, that particular damp cold that settles into everything. The yard was dark except for the light coming through the kitchen window. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked out at the garden. He said, "I should have called you. When things started getting bad, I should have just called you." I said maybe. I said I understood why he hadn't. He said, "You've always been the practical one. Your mother used to say that. She'd say, 'Claire doesn't need rescuing. She rescues herself.'" I said Mum had always been smarter than both of us. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. We stood there for a few minutes. The cold settled around us. Inside, I could see Diana through the window. She was standing near the kitchen island with Laura, talking quietly. Neither of them was smiling. My father said, "I'm going to have to think about what happens now, with the business." What Diana said in there, the plan she mentioned, I don't want you to think that was meant to push you out. It was more that I thought you'd moved on. That you'd built something that mattered to you and the company here was just... I stopped him. I told him I didn't need him to fix it tonight. I told him I'd come to give him a gift, not to make demands, and that whatever he decided about the company in the coming weeks, I trusted him to be fair. I said I'd spent 8 months making sure he had the stability to make that decision from a position of strength rather than panic, and that was all I'd wanted. He turned and looked at me the way he used to look at me when I was small and had done something that surprised him. He said, "When did you grow up this completely?" I told him, probably around the time he stopped noticing. He laughed for real that time, a short, surprised laugh, and then he pulled me into a hug that felt like the ones from when I was 11, before any of this. Before the divorce and the distance and the years of phone calls with careful cheer, I let it last. Then I told him to go back to his party. He went inside. I stayed on the deck for another few minutes, just breathing the cold air. There was a moment, a small one, where I thought about everything that could have gone differently. If I had said something 2 years ago, if Diana had been different, if he had been different, if I had been less inclined to solve problems in silence and more willing to simply say, "I see what's happening and I want to help." There's no clean answer to that. Some families communicate in declarations, and some communicate in acts, and mine had always been the second kind. I did what I could with the instincts I had. I don't know that I'd change it. I went back inside. The party had thinned, it was past 9, and the guests who had children had started making their way out. I found my aunt in the kitchen, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, and it was one of the better 20 minutes of the entire trip. As I was getting my coat, Laura appeared in the front hallway. She looked like she'd been thinking carefully about whatever she was about to say. She said, "I talked to my mom. She's going to say this herself, but I wanted to say it too. The way we've treated you, the way I've treated you, I think we told ourselves a story about who you were that made it easier to justify." She paused. That wasn't fair. I looked at her. She was 26, and she had just said something that people twice her age spend their whole lives avoiding. I told her I appreciated it. I told her it meant something coming from her. She nodded. She looked at the floor. She said, "Is there any chance you'd want to have coffee before you fly back? Just the two of us, without all of this." I said I thought I could do that. She almost smiled. Diana was in the living room with my father when I stopped to say goodbye. She stood up when I came in, which she had never done before. She said, "Thank you for what you did, for the company, for the house. I know you didn't have to do that. I know you didn't owe us anything." She stopped. Then she said, "I know I haven't made things easy." I said families are complicated. She said they were. I shook my father's hand and then thought better of it and hugged him instead. He held on for a second longer than I expected. He said, "I'll call you next week. Really call you, not just check in." I said I'd like that. I took a cab to my hotel. Outside the window, the highway lights slid past in orange streaks, the city doing what cities do, carrying on, indifferent, full of other people in the middle of their own complicated evenings. I had the letter still in my bag, the original. I'd given my father a copy. I'd kept the original because my lawyer told me to, and because I had learned a long time ago that in matters of money and family, keeping records isn't distrust, it's just sense. Here's the thing I think about now, sitting with all of it. The moment I'd planned, the private moment before the party, just him and me and a cup of coffee, and the letter across the table was better in my imagination. What actually happened was messier and more public, and involved watching my stepmother make a joke at my expense in front of 40 people. But something about the messiness of it cracked something open that the tidy version probably wouldn't have. Diana apologized. Laura asked for coffee. My father said he'd really call. I don't know if any of those things would have happened if everything had gone the way I planned. Maybe the controlled version would have produced a gracious thank you, and nothing would have shifted at all. Maybe it needed to break open in front of people for it to mean something. Or maybe I'm just telling myself a story, the way we all do, to make peace with the fact that things rarely go the way we picture them. What I know is this: he's 60 years old. The house is his, the company is his. Whatever he does with both of them from here belongs to him. And sometimes that's the whole point of a gift.